That sort of inaugurated a period that did end with Saddam Hussein, yay, but it was just incredibly chaotic. There was a Ba'ath government coup, and then they got kicked out in a coup, and then the Ba'ath came back in a coup, and throughout this period of intense instability in Iraq, the Kurds were a big factor.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Marie, in charge of podcasting, and I'm afraid Rob isn't here because he had a Barcelona tattoo, so he's been deported. We don't know where. But we have an AI that sounds very like him. Hello, Rob. How are you this time?
Deep, 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 deep. Military-industrial complex. Beep, doop, deep. Yeah, so I've somehow been liberated from El Salvador. Delighted to be here.
But you did get a lot of Bitcoin, so it was worth it.
It was, man. I love that Bitcoin. Love them cryptos. Yeah, it's been an interesting week here in the United States, though I suppose this is going up a full 8 or 9 days from now. I had this, I'd sort of done shorts on this earlier, but it's really become clear to me at this point. I'm certainly getting ahead of myself. Maybe the MAGA agenda will prove to be a rousing success, but it's just become so clear to, I think, a lot of people that the Democrats are going to absolutely rampage in the 2026 election.
Have all the votes come in for that senator? What was it? A judge
There were
in a state?
There were a couple special elections. One was a Supreme Court judge in Wisconsin. Sorry, I guess this wasn't a special election. This was a normal election, but for a 10-year term, apparently.
Okay.
Which was maintaining a Democratic liberal majority on the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. Is it strange, you might ask, for a Supreme Court to be elected? Yes, I would think so. But every state can do this in a different way, and that's how Wisconsin does it. And a Republican, a particularly egregiously gross Republican on the topic of Israel and Palestine, I think his name is Randy Fine, was elected to replace famous idiot Mike Waltz in the U.S. House of Representatives. But he won by 15 points in a Trump plus 30 district. So that is not, in fact, a dispiriting piece of news for the Democrats. I think it was a theory that was completely vindicated, is that Democrats are just going to do better now in off-year elections and special elections, because the Republicans used to do better because they had, more of the educated. The educated have all now moved entirely to the Democratic Party. That exaggerates things slightly, but more affluent, more educated people are more likely to show up in non-presidential elections. Of course, the flip side of this is that we could just, every presidential election going forward, we could elect demented people like Trump.
Does America have enough of them? Are you not running out? Oh,
no, we won't. We won't. But beyond that, I think in 2028, it's just so apparent, as was very apparent to me by the end of the Trump administration, is that Donald Trump is not good at things, nor are most of the people in his movement. It's a pretty, the economic management is insane. The government management is insane.
But is it not normal to tell a load of government employees that they're fired and then tell them a couple of days later, nah, that was a joke, just please come in?
Yeah. The level of failure in government that we're going to see as a result, and it's going to be compounding year by year. I think they've really gone a little bit too far here, especially by making Elon Musk the
poster child,
the poster child of firing everybody, because it's not what the usual Republican dodge is. We make things worse. We quietly make government services worse, so everybody hates government services. But that's not possible this time around, because in 2026 and in 2028, even because of Elon Musk and his character and the way he's been going about this, even 4 years from now, and there's now scuttlebutt that he might be leaving government soon anyway, but even if he leaves this month, 4 years from now, the Democrats are going to be able to say, and certainly 2 years from now, the Democrats are going to be able to say, government sucks because Elon Musk fired everybody. And they're not going to be wrong.
If you want to do something like this, don't you have people that understand the government incredibly well so they know how to dismantle it?
Yeah. And nobody's really done that.
And also the whole fact you have someone who's a foreigner. Didn't Elon Musk technically, wasn't he an illegal immigrant when he first came over?
I believe so.
So
Yeah,
it's
I
like
don't
if
know the
someone
details.
that's started as an illegal immigrant just destroying a lot of basic functionality that America had, like it's a horrendous look.
Yeah, it's just there's nothing. I think there's supposed to be a big tariff announcement today. It seems to have farted out into a bit of a nothing burger. Who knows? Maybe that'll change by close of business.
And did Musk not spend a lot of money on this recent election?
Oh yeah, in Wisconsin, Musk. It's the most expensive state court election in U.S. history, and yeah, Elon Musk got creamed, which is lovely. Again, I've thought this from the outset, but it is actually important, all these battles between the Democratic Party factions, because in 2026 and in 2028, the Democrats are likely to win very big, and it would be nice if they actually had something that they wanted to do. So, Donald Trump's successor doesn't just win in 2032.
But Joe Biden might be feeling better by then.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. What a great choice he was.
So would you like to talk about someone who was betrayed by Trump?
Let's
Or a
do
group of
that.
people who are
Let's
very disparate?
Great segue. We've done our Trump discussion, and now it's time for everybody to eat your Wheaties. We're doing part 2 of Kurdish history this week because gosh darn it, I read all of this 600-page book on Kurdish
Yes.
history, and we're gonna talk about it. I think we left off last time with sort of the 1920s, and we made it through the incredibly horrific story of the Armenian genocide. And then the way that the Turks then turned around and turned on the Kurds who helped carry out that genocide. Just dark stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Dark stuff. And I think in the last episode, I underemphasized the level of betrayal that the allies of World War I committed against the Kurds. I emphasized, which is, I think, true, that the Kurds have been extraordinarily divided. They have been sort of behind, the Ottomans were 50 years behind Europe in terms of nationalism and state consolidation, and then the Kurds were 50 years behind the Turks, and that their sort of traditional networks of power, tribes, religions, that have really kept them from unifying and taking enough advantage of their opportunities. But it is in 1920, the end of World War I, there was this thing called, the pronunciation for which I really should have checked, the Treaty of Sèvres.
Silvra?
Sèvres.
Okay.
Sevres. Sèvres. I don't know. French. I don't know how you say it. The Treaty of Sèvres. It was imposed on the Ottoman Empire that had lost World War I, and it contemplated the setting up by the victorious allies of World War I of a Kurdistan, dividing up the old Ottoman Empire. And I don't think it was explicit, because this would actually have meant going after Kurdish territories in Iran as well, but some suggestion of that as well. So I don't want to underemphasize these were promises made by the victorious allies of World War II. However, these were promises that the victorious allies of World War I, not World War II, World War I, the victorious allies of World War I never had the actual power to carry this out. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was sent by the Ottoman government out to sort of settle some things in Anatolia. Then he decided to set up his own government, and that government successfully, quite heroically, kicked out the Greeks, the French, and the Italians, and took back control of what became modern Turkey. They were not able to hold on to modern Syria or modern Iraq, which the British and the French had plans for. The French had sort of always wanted a Mediterranean satrapy, and the British, who, being more powerful than the French, got Jerusalem, got Jerusalem and the oil in Iraq.
Yeah, wasn't France a little bit slow on the uptake of oil? Like Britain kind of took a lot of all the oily parts of the Middle East, and then France was a bit too in love with the romance of the region, and then realized, oh, we're being cut out of major resources.
I'm not sure if that's maybe. I think that's a plausible explanation. It's not one that I've delved into myself. I think it's just a dynamic throughout the British Empire, is that the British get all the useful bits, and their sort of follow-on empires get all
Get
the
everything else.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it's funny, you look at sort of I think French Empire, because of the Sahara, might actually technically have had more footprint, or certainly more footprint than the British in Africa, but the British had the diamond mines of the
Yeah.
south and the Suez Canal of the north. It's the British get all the useful stuff, and the French gets the prestige stuff, which is very typical. They did not have the power. They were folks who had expended a ton of money on World War I and owed a ton of money to the United States, and did not have the spare resources necessary to go into Kurdistan. The British figured out how to carve off the most useful parts of Kurdistan, what could have plausibly been Kurdistan. Even back then, they were interested in Mosul, I believe. Perhaps I'm incorrect, but I believe they were very interested in Mosul because of plausible oil resources that surrounded it. And yeah, Kurdistan was just not what they were going to do. And there was some talk of, Woodrow Wilson was going to do it. And Woodrow Wilson proved he couldn't even get the Treaty of Versailles signed, and the League of Nations that he'd come up with endorsed by the U.S. government. So a whole long-term military adventure in the middle of Asia Minor, I guess, or the far end of Asia Minor, was never really on the card. So this was just not something that was going to happen. The Kurds, who had always been very, very divided, found themselves divided in a new way. In a new, more intense way, with four countries that were becoming vastly more interested in nationalism. And I think to talk about the Kurds more broadly, we should probably talk about the four countries where they live. Iran has 8 million Kurds. These are Wikipedia numbers.
Yeah,
Who's to say
so
censuses? We're just
do
gonna,
vary.
according to Wikipedia, Iran has 8 million Kurds, which amounts to about 10% of the Iranian population. Iraq has 5.5 million Kurds, which amounts to 17% of the Iraqi population. Turkey has 14 million Kurds, which amounts to 18% of the population. And Syria has a tiny amount of Kurds, which amounts to 9% of the Syrian population, 1.7 million Kurds. The story that I think we want to tell today, and really the story of this book, is largely a story about the Turkish Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. One of the most interesting dynamics is the strength of the state versus how many Kurds are there. You could almost make like a quadrant thing here. There are tiny, tiny amounts of Kurds in Syria relative to the other countries, but Syria has always been a much weaker state than any of the others. Yes, certainly a under the Assad regime, a very like authoritarian, totalitarian, nasty bunch of folks for about 50 years, but kind of a brittle regime that also relied on minorities a lot to repress the 70% Sunni majority. So the Kurds were, despite being by far the smallest population of Kurds in Kurdistan, Syrian Kurds, especially over the past decade of the disintegration of the Syrian government, have managed to become very, very significant. Iraq would be the second weakest of these three states. What was great about reading this book is it's kind of like the post-independence history of all four of these countries. Though, of course, Iran and Turkey were always technically independent to some degree. But it is sort of like the 20th and 21st century history of all four of these countries gets told from one perspective in this book on the history of the modern Kurds by David McDowell. Iraq's history, and of course Iraq and Syria are the weakest of these countries because they don't have that long history of independence that Iran and Turkey do to a degree. Iraq is very weak and has a very large percentage of Kurds, 17% Kurdish. And I was really struck, certainly I was aware of the Iran-Iraq war and how the Kurds were in the middle of that, and the horrors of the Anfal campaign that are sort of the very real rationale why Saddam Hussein is known as this psycho murderer. And of course, Halabja, the Kurdish town that was wiped out with chemical weapons in the late 1980s. I was aware of all that. What surprised me about this book was the extent to which Iraq has never really had a good handle on its Kurds or its Kurdish region.
Would that be pretty good for the Kurds, or does that mean they keep getting, horrors put upon them?
Well, so the Kurdish region of Iraq, run by the Kurdish regional government, does not have independence. Will probably never have independence because not only does the United States not interested in that, but obviously none of Iraq's neighbors are at all interested in that. However, this weakness combined with Syria, incredible state weakness, just not that many Kurds. Iraq, incredible state weakness from the beginning of their being in Iraq under the British in the 1920s, has a lot of Kurds. So it makes sense, actually, that the closest to de facto independence that the Kurds have gotten at any point and are likely to ever get, specifically because of U.S. versus Saddam Hussein from the 1990s until I guess he was killed in 2006, the closest the Kurds will ever have to having a full state. And it still is pretty close today. I think that's a factor of the weakness of the Iraqi state. Now, what's interesting here is both Iran and Turkey are much bigger countries than Iraq and Syria, have much more developed. But I would say on almost every metric, Turkey is a vastly more powerful country than Iran is, which I think would be a very controversial thing to say. Turkey has its massive population, its massive economics, and very impressive military power from a context of maybe breaking down now, but tutelage, cooperation, and military treaty alliance with the United States.
Yes.
Whereas Iran has attained its power and it has from an incredibly oppositional, adversarial position with the United States for 40 years.
It occasionally gets on with Russia, but that's about it. Russia would never defend Iran.
And however, for a lot of the period that we're talking about here, Iran was actually, in as close or even closer, probably never even closer because it was never a NATO ally, but under the Shah, Iran was very closely affiliated with the United States, benefiting from a lot of the military cooperation or what have you. But for the past 45 years...
It was very close with Britain at the time as well.
Yeah, but for the past 45 years...
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. So absolutely, that's if we're talking about power ratings or whatever, Iran. But so it's a little mystifying to me. So why is the Kurdish issue such a huge issue in Turkey, but it's not such a huge issue in Iran? And I think it's fairly well, Turkey, it's 18% rather than 10%. But part of Iran being adversarial, a rogue state, a sort of on its own, and being quite authoritarian, is that it hasn't ever really had to convince anybody that they are treating their Kurds well. It's just not really... I mean, Iran has its own internal reasons for needing to treat its Kurds well, or basically just needing its Kurds to be pacified. And there's always a mix in any system. Even Stalin's Russia, there was a mix between the horrific repression and, sticks and carrots, rewards. That's sort of, even in the worst places, that is the case. And Iran is, by no means the worst place that we contemplate historically. But it's been an easier job, and there's just elements of the way that Persia is organized, the remoteness of everything, where the populations are, the mountainous nature, the fact that the Kurds are a large minority, but there are a lot of other minorities in Iran. So for whatever reason, the Iran story of the Kurds is one of the least interesting and least exciting, with the exception of the beginning in the 1940s, which is where we ended last time, which is the Republic of Mahabad, the Mahabad Republic, which is, interestingly, the first example of an attempt at an independent Kurdish state that existed for a whole year. But the reason it existed is because during World War II, Britain and the Soviet Union occupied parts of Iran, and the Republic of Mahabad was able to fit into the interstices there. And that's a really important dynamic of this story. In Syria, in Iraq, and Iran, it is when the great powers jump in, and of course, at the very beginning with World War I, it's when the great powers jump in and do some kind of war stuff that the Kurds have their greatest opportunities. And they had that in the Mahabad Republic. And I got to say, much as this book is structured, there's not a ton to say about the Kurdish Iranian experience. There it certainly exists. They have political parties. They have political parties that exist in tension with the two dictatorial systems that Iran has had over the past century, the Shah and then but for I think both the Shah and the Islamic Republic of Iran have both done, through means both fair and foul, have done a better job of crushing Iranian Kurdish autonomy since 1946 and the end of the Mahabad Republic. The great exception to this, of course, would be the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when both Kurdish regions of both Iran and Iraq essentially fought against their own countries in alliance with the countries that were fighting against them. So that would be the great exception, but I don't think I'm being too unfair in pointing out that after the crushing of the Republic of Mahabad in 1946, Kurdish autonomy in Iran isn't that big of a deal. And as we mentioned last time, part of this is because of religious divisions, because of a very big historical difference. The other three countries were part of the Ottoman Empire. We're closer to Europe. We're closer to a lot of dynamics that make them different from the Kurds of Iran, a third of which are Shia rather than Sunni, which is, which has, means that a third of the Iranian Kurds, whether or not it lasted, were initially more predisposed to the Islamic Republic of Iran than they would have been in other places. So I think it's a long way of saying that the Iranian Kurdish story is not as interesting or as fraught as it is in the other three places. And sadly, that's the most of what we're going to be saying about the Iranian Kurds. Turkey, I would argue the most powerful, most wealthy, most populous of these countries, has had a horrifically bad experience with its Kurds. I think in part, no, I don't think, I know in part because Turkey, under its old, more Kemalist secularist dispensation, but also under its new, more Islamist dispensation, Erdogan and whatnot, both have been really interested in appealing to Europe and making them look better in European eyes, which means that while certainly carrying out horrific crimes against Kurds, they were also concerned to emphasize that there was some kind of human rights trajectory here. So they just didn't have as free a hand as the Iranians did. They also do not have quite as complex a minority picture as the Iranians do. Don't get me wrong. Turkey has a tremendously complex minority picture. They've still got Assyrians. They've still got Armenians. They've still got Greeks. They've got Alevis, which are another dynamic that cross-cut with the Kurds.
And they'll be expanding their borders soon, so they'll have even more.
That too. There is certainly a growing Syrian Arab population. But in terms of, nobody else is 18% of, whereas Iran, I think, has 10% Kurds, and then they've got Azeri Turks, I think one of whom is the president now, and then they've got Baluchis, and and Arabs in Iran are a much bigger factor than they historically were in Turkey. In Turkey, it's the Kurds are sort of the main minority function. They are a big factor, and the Turks have a concern that the modern Iranian government does not have, which is portraying themselves as fit to be members of the European Union who treat the Kurds well. So that's just an interesting set of dynamics why things are so fraught with Turkey. Before the EU accession process, that large gulf of time between the 1920s and sort of the 1980s, really, or really before the 1950s, when more religious parties in Turkey, more democratic party, and that's an interesting thing, is both being more religious and being more democratic have gone hand in hand in Turkey in ways that make me a little uncomfortable and make a lot of analysts uncomfortable. But from the 1920s to the 1950s, level of repression against the Kurds that occurred with very little outside knowledge, just because it was the far east of the country. There wasn't much going on there economically. And I think for long periods of this time, it was kind of shut down to foreign visitors.
Was there much that the international community would have been able to do if they had known, or would they have just sort of let them continue on?
They would have let them continue on, and it's important that this is during the period of, the heights of the Cold War. Well, I suppose not in the 30s, but, this is during World War One and the run up to World War One, the run up to World War Two,
We'll
one and
get
two,
there.
very difficult for me today. In the 1930s, during World War Two in the 1940s, then the Cold War era, Turkey very savvily made itself neutral during World War II, and then a firm ally of the United States. And if you're a firm ally of the United States, well, who wants to know? Who wants to look into it? And the repression it seems this book makes pretty clear that the repression was quite outsized. You weren't allowed to speak Kurdish. You weren't allowed to teach your children Kurdish. You weren't allowed to have Kurdish names. Really, just on a lot of different levels. And what's interesting is this is kind of the point at which most of the Kurdish population of Syria started, or sort of got going. So Afrin, which we've talked about in the past, is sort of tucked up in the northwest of Syria, that Erdogan famously invaded in, I can't remember, it was 2018, and sort of ethnically cleansed in a really horrific manner. That is it's called Kurd Da, which I think is like Kurd. Another name for Afrin is Kurd Da, which is, I don't know, is
Mhm.
that, I think that's, like Kurd Mountain or Kurd
Okay.
Hill or something like that. And that has been Kurdish for at least 500 years. Most of the rest of the Kurdish population in Syria has been along that border, and a lot of that population has been refugees from repression in Turkey and, to a lesser extent, repression in Iraq. And that is a much more recent dynamic. I think it's the Jazeera region, which is the island in between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, tremendously fertile, really important breadbasket for Syria now, but apparently was kind of largely undeveloped for agricultural purposes before the 20th century. So certainly Kurdish folks who plausibly could have had Syrian citizenship, but a lot of refugees from Turkey and Iraq, along with Arabs and Assyrians and a bewildering mix of groups, started settling in that sort of that very fertile border area between Turkey and Syria, which is, of course, tremendously threatening to the Syrian government, which has, throughout the period of the 20th century, had programs to make sure more Arabs were up there, this, that, and the other thing. However, Syria and Turkey were opponents for most of the Cold War, and well after the Cold War. Syria was more affiliated with the Soviets. Turkey was a U.S. NATO ally. The Syrian regime definitely had some insecurities about Kurds and Kurdish population of Syria, but at the same time, they were very eager to host rebel organizations against Turkey,
Mhm.
specifically, most famously, the PKK.
Who are still going today?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually, whether they're still I think supposedly, as of a month or so back, they're supposed to dissolve and put down their arms, but we'll see if that actually happens, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that by the end of this. Well, I hope we get to that by the end of this, because we certainly don't want to do a Kurdish history part
Part
3,
three?
because nobody's listening to these. The PKK is more of a 1978 story. What's interesting is, and I think what we should do now is, before we get to what happened with Turkey and Syria over the PKK, we should probably shift over to Iraq. Iraq is, I mean, one of the saddest stories. Well, it's not this, they got to be kings, but it is a sad story. Have you seen Lawrence of Arabia? Do people still watch that movie?
I haven't seen it, but I know the gist.
It's, this romantic Peter O'Toole, goes, and it's the historical story of T.E. or T.H. Lawrence, I can't remember, who went and sort of, developed, is it offensive to say went native or what have you, but developed real
A bit of a Marco
affinities.
Polo sort of character.
Yeah, developed real affinities with the Arab populations that he helped fight against the Ottoman Empire, fight against the Turks during World War I. And then the British really betrayed sort of the heroic figures. I think one of them was depicted by Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is just magical. But Britain famously betrayed those folks who had controlled Mecca and Medina, sided with the Saudis, gave them Mecca and Medina, and then they felt kind of bad about screwing over the Hashemites, so they gave them Jordan and Iraq. The Jordan Hashemite family still survives. The Iraqi Hashemite family, I believe, was slaughtered in a rebellion in 1958. I'm not particularly sympathetic to royal families, but I don't believe they should be slaughtered in the streets. I think they should be exiled to, Switzerland or whatever.
Just the idea Switzerland is full of these ancient, neglected royal families.
I mean, isn't that what Switzerland's for? I don't know. So if you just look at the timeline here, Iraq, I believe, got some kind of quasi-independence. Egypt did this too. When the British were sort of negotiating ending their empire, I think Iraq and Egyptian resistance was strong enough that Egypt got some kind of quasi-independence from Britain in the 1930s, but not really. The British military was there until the 1950s, and Iraq sort of got something similar in the 1930s, I think. So it was always, and then of course World War II happens, and it's all sort of fraught, and then there's a coup, and by 1958, that sort of inaugurated a period that did end with Saddam Hussein, yay, but it was just incredibly chaotic. There was a Ba'ath government coup, and then they got kicked out in a coup, and then the Ba'ath came back in a coup, and throughout this period of intense instability in Iraq, the Kurds were a big factor. And Kurdish parties, interestingly, the sort of one of probably the three main parties across Kurdistan. There's the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which are the PUK, which are both Iraqi parties. And then there's the PKK, which is sort of a Turkish-Syrian thing. The oldest would be the Kurdistan Democratic Party that got its start in Iran as part of that Republic of Mahabad. That party continued, I think, with its existence, as that party throughout the periods of Iraqi independence and chaos leading to Saddam Hussein. And it still exists today. So this is the KDP goes back to 1946 and is probably the more powerful of the two parties in the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq today. And it was really striking reading about this and just how basically these governments that would keep falling in Iraq would keep falling for a lot of reasons. But Kurdish resistance, failure to manage the Kurds was a big part of this at every step. In the rise of Saddam Hussein in the 1970s, it's really horrifying to reflect that he was actually seen as a moderating influence on how the Iraqi government treated the Kurds, which is pretty shocking when you consider that, of course, he's the guy who became famous for genociding the Kurds in the 1980s and 1990s. So it was the autonomous Kurdish region, the truly autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq only dates until 1992 or thereabouts in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. But I was surprised the extent to which the Kurdistan Democratic Party was able to remain a going concern and actually have real control, at least of some regions in Kurdistan throughout this period of Iraqi independence, really throughout the existence of Iraq. And I was fascinated. Of course, it waxed and waned, and there were periods when the Iraqi government had more or less power over these Kurdish regions. But I was really surprised by the extent to which the kind of autonomy-ishness of Iraqi Kurdistan actually predates 1992 by quite some amount. I think the reason why Iraqi Kurdistan has been so durably independent-ish is because of the extreme instability of Iraq, this sort of country created out of whole cloth in the 1920s by the British, really let go of by the British until the 1940s, 1950s, and then you've got horrific coups and violence and civil wars going on pretty much until Saddam Hussein, who's this really authoritarian figure who, to hear some would tell it, was able to rise up the population a little bit before getting involved in insane wars that truly just trashed Iraq for decades to come, and of course the U.S. invasions. I wouldn't be surprised if some degree of autonomy persists in Iraqi Kurdistan. But I think that kind of illustrates just how fraught and how risky this whole project is. If you look at Iraqi Kurdistan on a map, it is not just landlocked, it is landlocked by countries that hate it.
By Iraq or the Kurds, do you mean?
I mean, the Iraqi Kurds. Yeah.
Mm.
So to the south, they have Iraq, which is like, you're the reason, this might be a little unfair, but it would not be a crazy interpretation for Iraq to be like, yeah, Kurdistan, that's why we've been so effed since the 1950s. Of course, Syria, because Iraqi Kurdistan, I believe, has a borders, well, it depends on how much territory, which waxes and wanes, that Iraqi Kurdistan can take. But I believe it shares borders with Turkey, Iran, and Syria, all of which are countries with their own Kurdish populations that they do not want to be independent. So yeah, the Turks have obviously always been really against the idea of Iraq having a Kurdish regional government with autonomy, as they've been really heavily repressing their folks. I don't think this guy McDowell really emphasized it, but it seems pretty straightforward to me that we can, to some extent, blame the incredible jump up of violence by the Turkish state against the Kurds in the 1990s. It's the 1990s. I've always known this. The 1990s are just renowned as like the dark times in the Turkish Kurdish conflict and the horrors of that. And yeah, like part of this is the massive refugee flows prompted by the first Gulf War. It's a really huge dynamic. The Kurdish regional government. So the Kurds, I think KRG might be a designation that is only after 2003, but after the first Gulf War in 1992, the Kurds did manage to set up a degree of autonomy, but the Iraqi government, was massively ethnically cleansing Kurds at the same time. So some Kurds, were able to go up to Erbil and Suleymaniye in the mountains and start setting up autonomy, but a lot of them just fled to Turkey. So you had hundreds of thousands of refugees coming into Turkey, and you had Kurds, specifically the PKK, among a whole galaxy of it. We're only really talking about the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the KDP, and the PKK today, but there are religious Kurdish policies. There are, every political division of leftism you can imagine had its own specific party, this, that, and the other thing. It's just these three are the big parties. So yeah, with the Gulf War and this massive spate of Kurdish refugees and Kurdish autonomy being set up in Iraq, the aspirations of Kurds went through the roof, and they were led by the PKK, which also, like most revolutionary parties, was very interested in co-opting and killing any other Kurdish parties so they could be the only.
That's what I was going to say. Are they quite welcoming to all types of Kurds? Because they are an incredibly diverse bunch. Quite often us Westerners will just mush them all together.
Oh no. So like there's like the even throughout this I mean, the 1980s and 1990s, just generally horrific times to be Kurds. For the 1990s, for the Turks, 1990s in Turkey, 1980s in Iraq. And throughout this period of time, the Kurds are fighting each other. These three parties are often fighting each other. It seems like the PUK, the less powerful party in Iraq, might be a little more sympathetic to the PKK. They both have more left-wing, left-oriented ideas. But the KDP and the PUK have...
Patriotic Union of Kurdish?
Yes, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, I believe, and the Kurdistan Democratic Party. These are the two main parties in Iraq. And throughout the history of Kurdish autonomy in Iraq, they have fought each other, sometimes physically. Since, I think, 2003, it has mostly been politically, but they are rival patronage networks. So they fight each other constantly. And the KDP and the PKK fight against each other, sometimes physically. 1990s, the Iraq War creates a much more solidified, 1990s, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, creates a much more solidified autonomy for Kurds in Iraq. The KDP and the PUK, the two Iraqi Kurdish parties, use this time to build up some real institutions, but also to compete against each other almost as strongly as they're competing against Baghdad. It was actually, I think, yes, it was actually a thing during the 1990s where the U.S. government, as part of its, oh yeah, under Clinton, we definitely want to regime change Saddam Hussein, considered it a big diplomatic victory to get the two Kurdish parties. This is after Halabja. This is after the Anfal campaign. This is after Saddam Hussein's genocidal actions against the Kurds in the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. After that, the Clinton administration considered it a victory to get the KDP and the PUK to agree with each other that they would no longer work with Saddam Hussein. This is after Saddam Hussein had been genociding the Kurds. And that's a really important data point here to, like, not only are all the Kurds across these regions not working with each other, they're often working with their oppressors against each other, which is just sort of an indicator of how unlikely a broader Kurdistan is to come about.
How do the Americans influence this era? Are they a wee bit sort of, I don't know, happy-go-lucky? Like sort of like the idea of like a headline and then they're on to something else? Like, are they a strange sort of entity in the region?
Well, the United States is the reason why Kurdish autonomy is set up in the 1990s in Iraq. It is the reason why the Turks had to start beginning to acknowledge that Kurds might have some rights in the late 90s and the early aughts. So the United States is ever present, whether or not the United States is actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of the Gulf War, the United States famously encouraged both Kurds and Shia to rise up against Saddam Hussein. These populations did that, and the United States did nothing. But we did do more to protect the Kurds. I think there is a particular character, or I guess a series of characters in the Barzani family. Oh, and it's worth pointing out. So the Kurdistan, the KDP, the one founded in Iran in 1946, it's kind of the personal fiefdom of now multiple generations of the Barzani family, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, kind of the personal fiefdom of now multiple generations of the Talabani family. And Barzani apparently, just over and over in this book, is described as being overly reliant on the United States and Israel and essentially being convinced that the United States and Israel were going to make great sacrifices to set up a Kurdistan. Neither the United States and Israel ever had any interest in actually doing that. And this persists over and over and over again, that the Kurds are like, oh, we have the support of the United States. And I think we see over and over and over again that, yeah, sure, the Kurds have the support of the United States to the extent that it screws over people that we don't like Assad or the Islamic State or Saddam Hussein, but not to the extent where we're going to make Turkey mad or expend any money or, God forbid, soldiers that we don't want to make this happen. So yeah, I think that the consistent story of betrayal of the Kurds by the United States is largely accurate, but also, what did you expect? Like what did you, like, after, over and over and over and over and over again, why would you? And I think there's some indication that the Syrian Kurds always had a pretty good idea they were going to get screwed over by the United States. And it's sort of it's really only the extreme mercurial nature of how Donald Trump treated the Kurds during his first term that they objected to. They're like, yeah, obviously you're going to screw us over, but give us a week's notice, was sort of sort of what. But it does appear that the KDP has just really been the Barzani family group in Iraq has been pretty, I guess, touching, but honestly pretty dumb in their continued, like, oh, the U.S. is going to help us with this, and then we just don't.
But compared to a lot of other countries in the region, do you think America has been slightly positive? The fact it kind of encourages Turkey to be work towards helping them, instead of going, yeah.
I don't know. It's like, who else was going to influence this one way or the other? Like, it just, yeah, I guess we've been nice and supportive to both Syrian and Iraqi Kurds who wanted autonomy in different times, but because of horrific situations that we had created by overthrowing Saddam Hussein and by opening up all that territory for jihadists in northern Syria. So yeah, it's hard for me to be like, yay, America. here, especially as we are in the process of abandoning them once again, Syria's Kurds specifically. So 1990s and aughts with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the KDP and the PUK, get to set up a truly like autonomous regional government. There's some indication that they did a really good job of negotiating with the Baghdad government in 2005. But it was fascinating. So this is a book by a guy who is mostly what's the word I'm looking for? He's very objective. This is a very long
Very measured.
book. Yeah, measured. It's a very long history book. When he gets to his description of how, the Iraqi Kurds have fared in the 21st century, he's basically just like, F these guys. Like, the leadership of the Iraqi Kurds has been nightmarishly irresponsible, corrupt, and abusive. And he just, they're certainly authoritarian and will disappear their enemies or whatnot. But his main dispute or complaint is that just they've squandered the incredible opportunities that the Kurdistan Regional Government was given. They just really, really screwed it up. This guy, and I think most people, are a lot more sympathetic to the Syrian Kurdish groups that rose up in the aftermath of, or rather as a result of the U.S.'s destruction of Syria in the 2010s. It's interesting. It's pretty clear to me that Turkey is pretty accurate when he says that Syria's Kurds are basically the PKK, are basically the Turkish rebel group recognized as terrorists, not just by Turkey or in the United States, but also most of the countries in Europe. The sort of political development and it's interesting because in the early years of the Syrian civil war, both the Iraqi Kurds and the Turkish Kurds, PKK affiliated types, tried really hard to cultivate folks in Syria, and the PKK just won on every level, just because they're just more sympathetic, frankly.
Okay.
So the PKK, and also just had much deeper roots in Syria because the Assad administration, the Assad regime, was really interested in working with the PKK against Turkey until the late 1990s, when the charismatic founder of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, had been in Syria. PKK was like a Syrian organization primarily, obviously operating in Turkey, carrying out military affairs, until I think it was 1998 or thereabouts, when the Turks basically said, hey, you either cut this out, Syria, or we're just invading. Because at that point, of course, the Syrians no longer had the Soviet Union's protection. And so, yeah, the Turks literally, I think, massed troops on the Syrian border, at which point the Syrians said, hey, the PKK is no longer welcome here. Abdullah Öcalan toured the world for a year or two until he was, I think, kidnapped by Turkish special forces in Kenya, of all places. Öcalan has been in Turkish prisons for the past 26 years.
Wow.
Which is an interesting way to live. Interestingly, he still has pretty fanatical dedication from the PKK and, of course, from Syria's Kurds. There was this classic, the United States was always really, really concerned to reassure Turkey that no. The Syria's heroic Kurds have nothing to do with the PKK, yet whenever Syria's heroic Kurds took a new town or something, they put up like a big flag with Abdullah Öcalan's face. So it's just a little hard to deny.
Where do you get them?
Yeah, I just don't. No, he's just this dude we're kind of interested in, man. But Öcalan's journey as a prisoner of the Turkish government has been kind of fascinating. You would imagine that perhaps the PKK would be like, well, clearly this guy's been brutalized and tortured. We can't believe anything he says anymore. But apparently, Öcalan, as you'd expect, as a captive of the Turkish government, has on multiple occasions over the past, 20 years said, okay, it's ceasefire time. We're done here. And the PKK has sort of dutifully said, okay, we'll do that. And then it's usually been the Turkish government that has not honored this, that, or the other thing, which prompts the PKK, or perhaps more radical elements within the PKK, to go back to warring against the Turkish government. And that's been a sort of interesting dynamic in, I think we talked more in the last episode about how religion sort of crosses across these lines, this, that, and the other thing. And one of the cases that the more religious government of Turkey, starting in, I think, 2002 or thereabouts, under Erdogan, was saying, well, hey, like, we're not as fervently Turkish nationalist as the Ataturk and his successors are. We're interested more in Islam. So this should help us, actually build bridges with Kurds. And to some extent, he was right. Unfortunately, the Syrian civil war kind of threw this out of kilter. There were terrorist attacks in Turkey, across Turkey, from multiple different factions in the Syrian civil war. The Kurdish population of northern Syria became staunch U.S. allies against the Islamic State, and Turkey really, really hated that. And that derailed the peace process within Turkey, which was quite sad, because Kurds had made great strides under Erdogan. There is, I believe, Öcalan himself, years ago, if not decades ago, renounced the idea of independence for Kurds in Turkey, and just wants like a degree of autonomy or a degree of cultural respect, much of which, a lot of which has been achieved. But the Syrian civil war, you had, and of course the Islamic State. So the regional government in Iraq had three big bumps up in its power. It is the first Gulf War. It gets some sort of autonomy. The entirety of the rest of Iraq is left in shards after the U.S. 2003 invasion, and they're able to set themselves up again. And then when the Islamic State came rampaging out of Syria into Iraq, the Kurds again were able to take more territory. The city of Kirkuk, that they'd been arguing with the Iraqi government with since 2003. They're going from sort of strength to strength over this. However, they didn't really manage to win the ideological battle in Syria. So you've got the SDF, there's a whole bunch of acronyms, but it is a more PKK-affiliated group that is in control in Syria. So it's not just the Turkish government that threw out the peace process. There's certainly the more powerful actor. In 2015 or thereabouts, you've got the autonomy in Iraq. You've got Rojava, which is the Syrian Kurdish territory that is cropping up, and basically a whole bunch of Kurdish cities and towns in Turkey decided to try to bandwagon on that. And you got a horrific return, briefly, thank God, but got a horrific return to violence between Kurds and the Turkish state in Turkey at just about the time I was leaving the country in 2015, 2016. And it was really frustrating because there's a lot of peaceful Kurdish parties that, yes, have affiliations with the PKK, but they were figuring out how to work in the Turkish political system. What has happened since 2015 and the crushing of the Islamic State is that in different ways, all of these autonomy stories have been crushed. First, of course, was Turkey, went in, retook all of these cities and towns and neighborhoods that had tried to do Kurdish autonomy. Most horrifically in Diyarbakir, a place I was lucky enough to be able to visit in 2011. They have this beautiful old historic downtown that was apparently entirely destroyed by fighting between Kurds and the Turkish state in 2015, 2016. So that dream died rather quickly, fell into general repression. The Erdogan government decided it had to work because it had lost a lot of support elsewhere, started working much more closely with Turkish nationalists. So that was shut down and over. In the Islamic State issue in Iraq, weirdly first gave the Kurds a lot and then took a lot away from the Kurds. Islamic State comes through, they get Kirkuk, they're able to take more territory, make more demands, but also through U.S. support, Iranian support, the Iraqi government builds up more power than it had ever had. Surprisingly, the United States wasn't super concerned to set up a really powerful Iraqi military when it left. However, it definitely wanted a more powerful Iraqi military to retake Mosul. And you had all these militias that were put together, the Popular Mobilization Front put together by Iran. So the Kurds briefly take Kirkuk and they're like, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do what the United States has told us to never to do, Turkey has told us never to do, even though at this point Turkey and specifically the KDP, but I think all Iraqi Kurds have been working closely with Turkey to sell oil for a while. Okay, we're going to do what the U.S. told us never to do, Iran told us never to do, Turkey told us never to do, the Iraqi government told us never to do. We're going to have a referendum on independence.
Uh-oh.
So they had a referendum on independence in 2017. I think it was uproariously successful. And within 2 months, the Iraqi government had rolled back into all of the territory that they had taken because of the Islamic State, took Kirkuk. That's gone for all time. And I think this is part of why McDowell was so angry at the Iraqi government. It's essentially, we're now at a point where, okay, so that happened. There's a new peace process between the Turks and the Kurds, which I don't have a ton of hope for because, as has happened in the past, Erdogan is pairing this peace process with the Kurds with an attempt to repress democracy in another area. But that brief moment of opening between Kurds and Turkey essentially made it possible for the now Turkish client state of Syria to make some degree of peace. Nothing's settled yet, but is basically done an agreement with Syria's Kurds that will function to break down the independence of Syrian Kurdistan. So what's happening now is we're kind of at the end of a period of extraordinary opportunity for the Kurds that it would be unfair to say that it has amounted to nothing. But like, if you wanted to set up a broader Kurdistan across Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, the last 2 decades were the time to do it. Both Iraq and Syria were crushed. Turkey was much more interested in appealing to Europe and human rights than it used to been. If there was ever a time when there was a real possibility of a Kurdistan, it was over the past 20 years, and it has passed. So It's fascinating delving into this history. I hope we've managed to express some of it, but I do think that the chances of an actual Kurdish state have come and gone.
But is your opinion the future is quite bleak for the Kurds?
I hope that things are actually looking up a little bit. I have hopes that the fact that we've got peace processes going on in both Turkey and Syria at the same time indicates that at least we won't be seeing the kinds of widespread extermination of the Kurds that we saw certainly in Iraq in the 1980s and more debatably, but not that debatably, in Turkey in the 1990s and in parts of Syrian Kurdish territory across the teens. So hopefully we could be done with that. The most important thing for the region is peace. To the extent that efforts towards Kurdish independence are hurting that, they should be dissuaded. But obviously, more autonomy and respect for Kurdish populations is something we should all hope for. But the most important thing at this point is peace. And the fact that the PKK is talking with Turkey and the fact that SDF is talking with the new government of Syria are 2 really hopeful dynamics that I'd like to emphasize more. But if you're looking in terms of broader history and like the potential for an independent, unified Kurdistan, if that were ever going to happen, it was going to happen over the past 20 years, and it has not happened. It would be my read.
So the hope is that there will just be a peaceful population within another country.
One would hope, or, broader unity for all, just part of a larger European Union, Rory. Who knows?
Wow. On that cheery note, we'll catch you next time. Thank you for joining us.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.